Hello, Wellspring. My name is James Powell, and I host a podcast called This Little Light of Mine. I'm looking forward to joining you on Saturday, March 27th, as you continue your journey to becoming a welcoming and affirming space for all of God's people. Growing up in a church much like Wellspring Worship Centre, I remember the scared little boy I was, sitting in my church pew. I thought I was all alone, sinful, and had nobody I could trust to share what was really going on inside for me. Unlike my siblings and friends, for me, love, marriage, family, and happiness, those were just a dream. And I share that dream in my first This Little Light of Mine podcast episode. But unlike my dream, my reality was very different. I was taught by my church, my community, and my family that I was unlovable, and that I was a sinner, and that I was dirty and unworthy of being loved just because of who I was and how God created me. That thinking and those beliefs nearly cost me my life. But that was only the first part of my journey. Since sitting in that pew so many years ago, I've affirmed how loved I am by God. I am proudly a gay Christian, and I know that my sexuality is a gift from God. Starting to use my authentic voice over the past year has been an uncomfortable and liberating journey, and I'm learning that spiritual growth is birthed out of the discomfort that I tried to numb and avoid for decades. And as I look forward to our conversation on March 27th, I want to put forward a few questions for you to think about. What is your definition of a welcoming and affirming church? How would a 10-year-old child questioning their sexuality know that you are a safe place for them? What scares you about being welcoming and affirming to LGBTQ2S+ people? What would change if you were a fully affirming and welcoming church to LGBTQ2S+ people? What would change personally? And what would change for your church? What questions are you scared to ask about anything LGBTQ2S+? And finally, how would you respond to your daughter, your niece, granddaughter, or friend who comes to you and says, I want to come to your church with my girlfriend? Would we be loved and accepted at Wellspring? My prayer is that we can all approach this time together from a posture of openness, vulnerability, and a healthy touch of discomfort. This healthy discomfort is Jesus' message of radical love and social justice we read about in the Bible. And I'm looking forward to living and experiencing that love with you on Saturday, March 27th. See you then. I'm gonna let it shine everywhere I go.
Well, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us on a Saturday afternoon. My name is James. I'm the pastor of Wellspring Worship Centre, which is the church that we currently find ourselves in. And today I'm going to be having a conversation with my new friend, James Powell. Thank you so much for being here, James.
Thanks for having me.
We've been, as a church, wondering about what it means to love our neighbour more. And one of the things we've recognized that in Toronto, a lot of our neighbors identify as queer. They're within the LGBTQ2+ community. And we know that Jesus calls us to love our neighbor. And we also know that in the past, the church hasn't done as good a job as that as we would like, and certainly as good a job as we think Jesus would like. And there's going to be a variety of people watching this, and there'll be people who just can't understand why the church doesn't want to be more welcoming. And there'll be other people watching who struggle because they've been raised in different ways and been taught that scripture means certain things. And we pray that during this time, this be a time of learning and growth and encouragement, We pray this to be a time when we be curious and excited to learn more about other people. And I think it's really important that anyone watching who sees me as a pastor, it's important that I come out and say, I have said, come out, wow, that could be quite a twist for this, wouldn't it? It's important that I come and say, I've got this wrong in the past too. There are times that I've said careless things, thoughtless things, and I know that I want to be better. But if you're watching and you're someone who has been hurt, then all I can do is apologize and promise that I am trying to be better, and we as a community are trying to be better. And part of trying to be better is listening to stories and listening to people and giving a space for voices that maybe we haven't had a chance to hear otherwise. And that's one of the reasons that I've asked James to speak to us today. James has an amazing podcast where he's very honest and very vulnerable about the state of things. One of the best things is James has so much to say, it means I don't need to say too much. And so after this initial blurb, I promise you, it's going to be a lot more excitement and curiosity and learning from James. So James, I'm going to pass things over to you for a second to see if you want to introduce yourself. And I'll say thank you for joining us. And all this stuff will be uploaded. So if you miss something or if you want to go back to it, that's okay. There's space to do that.
Well, thanks for inviting me here today. It was a little strange getting ready to come into church because I grew up in a church just like this and haven't really been back in a church to talk with a church for years. And so I was a little bit nervous and anxious kind of coming in today. What am I going to say? How do I prepare? Do I have my verses down? And a lot of that kind of memory was coming back to me. But yeah, I grew up in a church like this. And like a lot of kids, I had dreams. I dreamed about owning an island and a helicopter. Humble dreams, yep. I dreamed about falling in love and getting married. I dreamed about being a pastor and also the president of the United States, even though I'm not American, but wanted to be a pastor, wanted to have a kid, many kids. And like a lot of people, I really enjoyed my experience growing up in the church and the community that we had. Except all of my dreams, I always knew were just dreams and that none of them were going to come true for me, especially the president of the United States part. But I knew for me, because of who I was, and I remember probably as far back as 5 or 6 feeling different. I didn't really have a name or a word for that, but I knew that there was something wrong with me. And the growing up in the church in the 80s and 90s and kind of all that was going on in society and especially in Canada with our rights and freedoms and all that kind of stuff that was going on, it was pretty clear to me that who I was a sinner. I was unworthy. I was taught that because of who I was, because I was different, because I was gay, as I started to get into that word, I was not allowed to love. I couldn't be like the other kids that I was growing up with. The challenge with that too was that nobody saw that on the outside. I was terrified that people were going to see that, and I thought that everybody saw that, but nobody really did. And so a lot of that fear and anxiety was all internalized, and slowly over the years I learned to hate myself, and I started to believe that I was evil, I was sinful, and I accepted Jesus Christ as my personal savior at Muskoka Baptist Conference way back when. I think I was like 6 or 5, and I remember that being a big highlight. I'd done something right. I was saved for eternity, and but I still believed that I was a sinner because I was having these thoughts. And back then, homosexuality was a choice according to the church. And so me thinking that way was a sin, not just me acting that way. And so even having those thoughts, and I remember over the years crying myself to sleep, begging, like, God, like, I will do anything, take these feelings away. And year after year after year after year, nothing would happen. And that was a lot more damaging than I actually thought it was going to be. But over my life, I don't know, I was probably around, I don't know what age, maybe around 13 or 14 when I made the decision. I'm not going to let anybody see how broken I am. I'm not going to let anybody see how hurt I am, because that's just going to give them an in. That's going to be a way that people can say, we knew. And I designed my life around that. I want to be the best at everything that I do, get the best marks, the best job, the best whatever I could to get that kind of gold star. And that became a journey towards self-worth through external validation. And it worked for a while. You're able to go kind of up that hill. But there was an entire underground life that was going on, an entire underground world where I would escape to, where my pain would come out, where I could be just me. And I couldn't feel just me in my family. I couldn't feel like just like me in the church. I couldn't feel just like me with God, because that person was not welcome. That person was not accepted. And I call that the first lie that I bought in my life, that I wasn't welcome in church. But where I was welcome was in the gay community. And I started very, very young. And I've just started talking about this in the last year and sharing with my parents that I started going to the gay community and escaping there and became sexualized at 12, 13. And it was amazing. I was welcome with open arms. I could be fully me. And I thought that was love. I was like, wow, I don't have to hide any part of who I am. I can just be me. This is amazing. And it wasn't until probably 42 that I realized that was sexual assault. That was gang rape of a minor. But being that age and being in that environment, I was like, wow, this is what welcoming is. This is what love is. And that was the second lie that I bought, that my worth is dependent on my body. And that's what I put forward. That's what people accept me for. But that was also hidden. So I started kind of this split life of performance and acting, and it didn't end up very well. And so a couple years ago, I ended up being in a rehab center in Philadelphia. My parents came down, and I shared so much of the parts of my life that I've been hiding, the parts of my life that I've been running from. And we all sat around and with tears in our eyes said, how did we get here? How did we all end up here? This was never our intention. And my parents had no idea that all of my life had been going on kind of underground, behind the scenes to them. And that's where I made the decision to start talking about who I am, to start sharing who I am. And as I went into recovery, as I worked with my trauma therapist, I realized the light inside of me, God inside of me, Jesus, has always been shining, has always been there. But I allowed external lies, man-made lies, to say, oh no, not for you. Those clouds are covering up that light. And I believed it. And so over the last year, I've been sharing through my podcast, This Little Light of Mine, kind of that journey. And I look at that as, this is my recovery journey. This is me reclaiming my voice. This is me kind of coming back and realizing I am loved, and I always have been. And so it's been an interesting year sharing that and kind of being on this journey with my parents, with friends, with other people that have been reaching out. And so I'm glad to be here. I'm glad to be having these conversations. And I never thought I would be, but thanks for having me.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for sharing those vulnerabilities. I think me and I'm sure a lot of the people watching this just want to take that 12-year-old boy and say, like, you're loved, it's okay. As you say, that desperation for community, we will find community one way or another. And if we don't find it in a healthy place that loves and respects us, we'll find it elsewhere. And what a desperately sad thing that a 12-year-old boy needed to go to such desperate depths to find that acceptance. And thank you for being so honest and sharing those pieces. It's so fascinating to me as well that actually the concerns and hurts there actually, even kind of defining your value by your body. Like, I'm sure there's a lot of people watching. There's so many commonalities here with so many people's struggles, and yet what you're saying is enhanced all the more. You say there's those moments of hurt, and I do thank you, and I think it's really important that we be listening to these voices, and I'll affirm what James has said there, that something that's really important to us is we believe that everyone is created in the image and likeness of God. We believe that is something that can never ever change, can never be taken away from someone, regardless of what they do, and regardless of anything that has been done to them. But I think it's such a sad thing that maybe that's not preached as often as it should. Maybe that's not shared as often as it should. Maybe that's not something that church leaders talk about as often as they should.
And I think it is taught a lot.
Okay.
But I don't think what we talk about are the asterisks that follow that.
Sure.
And when you're flipping through one of those magazines and you see that ad for like the smoking cessation or whatever the ad, and then you flip the next 3 pages and it's all the legal lines of all the different things that can happen. That's how it felt for me when those things were being taught in church. And we also were constantly taught about how we are all made uniquely. And the snowflake analogy of everybody is different and every snowflake is unique. And yet there's this belief that was downloaded to me, or that was taught to me, that, you're all different, but you all have to be the same. And I never really understood how that worked, because I was very different. We're supposed to be unique, but the same. We're all supposed to behave the same way, believe the same thing, act in the same way, but we're uniquely created by God. And that's not compatible. And as a child, I got the impression you're not allowed to ask questions. These are just things like believe. And these are the things that we're taught. And I think if anybody's walked by Young and Dundas and the man that just bounces out and says, believe, that kind of image came into my head.
I want to apologize to anyone watching that's been traumatized by that guy. That is, that's not how I do things.
He's very dedicated, though.
Very dedicated.
And that's how I was raised. You believe these things. And I was taught this has just always been the way, all the way back to the beginning of time. And one of the things I've been really interested in seeing my own growth and the growth with my parents who are also on this journey, I felt really dumb. And as I start to read a lot more and explore a lot more and look into the Bible a lot more, I realized, wow, I just believed. I didn't question. I didn't look into how these things came to be. I just assumed they've always been there. And literally my thinking was the Bible just dropped out of heaven one day, and it always was, and there's no inconsistencies. It's the Bible is this one book. Everything in it is valid and relevant for right now. no concept of like what the difference between the Old Testament or Old Covenant and the New Testament. Like we looked at it like it is one book, everything in there. And the more that I read and the more that I explore, I felt really dumb because I never asked those questions. And I think as I reflect on that, because I always thought I was a sinner, because I always was in hiding and in terror of being found out, I never asked those questions. I never dug into those things because I was always living in a hypervigilant state. And I think a lot of marginalized people, as I reflect on this, because they don't feel safe, they don't look into those things. And over the last year, as I've come out a lot more and my self-esteem and self-worth has grown, I felt more comfortable, more safe to start exploring things like the Bible, asking those questions. And I guess I look at it, and when the Bible has been weaponized, you don't really usually cozy up to a Scud missile and say, hey, I want to get to know you. Let's dig in here. Let's get comfortable.
Especially if that Scud missile actually destroyed the house you grew up in.
Right. And yet that's how I always viewed the Bible. And as a young kid, I remember opening the Bible in the pew in front of me, and it is clear as night and day. Homosexuality not inherit the kingdom of God. And like black and white, red and white, whatever it was, I was condemned. And there's no way around that. And when you think of that 8-year-old child, and especially now when like you can Google Bible homosexual, done instantly. And that destroyed me. That condemned me. And one of the things that my parents have talked about is like, well, why didn't you come and ask us? And I look at them and I'm like, are you kidding? Like, why would I not come and ask you? And I don't know that people understand the terror in that and the stories that are in that. It was interesting. I just finished releasing a couple of episodes where I interviewed my parents. And it's so neat to see the different perspectives between my parents' view of how I grew up and my view of how I grew up. And as I look back at my kind of church upbringing and the things that Focus on the Family would say and the different petitions that our church would sign against gay marriage, and oh my gosh, they're going to force our pastors to marry those homosexuals and we're going to lose our churches and they're going to be locked up, and everybody was clutching their pearls and signing the petitions because they wanted. And I was sitting there thinking, oh my gosh, they're talking about me.
I think that in itself is such a powerful image as well. And thinking about how often we've been in spaces, and James and I were talking beforehand that there are different ways that people lack privilege, and some of those lacks of privilege are very visual, and some of them aren't. And for better or worse, people are probably less likely to be people who are slightly racist are less likely to be slightly racist around people of a different race to them. Some people will be more overtly so. That's problematic. But one of the things with the unseen lack of privilege is that we never actually know the damage that we might be doing to the person in the room. Mm-hmm. I really love what you had to say there. Even the idea that being able to ask questions itself is kind of a privileged thing too. I as a ticking all the privilege boxes that I do, I don't need to worry about asking questions because no one's really going to think that much less of me, or maybe if they are, I don't care anyway. Whereas for someone that lacks that privilege, how much more difficult that can become. What's exciting for me is that caused you to dig deeper, and which for me is, I'll call it a miracle. I'm okay calling it a miracle because I don't think I have that strength. I think if something had wounded me as much as a weaponized Bible had wounded you, I'd probably walk away.
But can I jump in there? Because I think
sure.
It allowed me to dig deeper after I had no place to go.
Yeah, sure. So I don't want to, as you say, you you hit rock bottom. Those are your words.
Yeah. And after, this was probably maybe just coming up on 2 years ago, where I wanted to end my life again, and had those similar thoughts and plans of there's no way out. And like that song, Jesus Take the Wheel, it was literally that, not because it was a nice to do. It was like, there is no other option here. And I think that's this, I don't know, I'm mixed on this. I'm obviously don't want people to get to that point, but I'm also grateful that I got to that point.
And to be clear, I think that is awful. So I people are thinking like, hey, James, good news. At least you hit rock bottom. I think that's a wonderful example of God being able to work and redeem in the midst of tragedy and horror. But I don't think that means it's God's desire that we...
No.
I think God would much prefer that you got into the Bible without having to hit rock bottom. But fortunately, there's a... And again, what... For me, though, you're saying that actually then the Bible becomes a lot more alive. I mean, I celebrate that some of the Bible is poetry. And what is there to learn through that gaze of poetry? We celebrate the fact that Jesus taught in parables, which, if we want to be blunt, he taught in things that didn't happen. Like that's so how do we deal with that he dealt in stories. And so what does it look like to approach the Bible with a more robust view? And then I guess, I mean, the $1 million question, elephant in the room, is like, okay, so how do you deal with those questions? And this is not to catch you out, because I think we come to the same conclusion, but I'd love to hear your perspective on, okay, so the Bible has these things to say. I still think the Bible is relevant. I still think it reveals who God is. I still think that I am loved by God and created in God's image. How do you bring all those pieces together?
Yeah, and that's a big question. And it's interesting because I think as my parents and I talked recently, we're learning to live and love within the shades of gray. And so much of what we were taught, and my parents were taught, and my parents' parents were taught growing up in the church, was there is no shades of gray. It's black and it's white. And when you take a look at the Bible, and when you take a look at the Old Covenant, that was how it was. And I'm not saying that that wasn't true. I'm not saying that that wasn't what needed to happen. But that's not what needs to happen for us now. And as I look at the Bible and look into the Bible, I see that it has been manipulated by man. It didn't literally just fall out of heaven. It isn't this magical book that, as I was a child, I literally believed it was this magical book. Every word I was told was God breathed. Nothing was out of alignment. Nothing could get into that book that was not perfect. And as I now look at those verses in that word homosexuality, and you start to look back and you're like, hey, wait a second. That wasn't added to the Bible until 1946. And it was this American dude that put it in there. But since then, he's actually come out as gay.
I did not know that.
Yeah. He's come out as gay and said, I made a mistake. I knew I made a mistake, and I went back to have that corrected, but I was told it was too late. And it's interesting, there's actually a documentary being made right now called 1946, the documentary, all about that, and they found the guy. And they're talking with him, and it's by the same producers that did a documentary years ago called For the Bible Tells Me So.
That is a fantastic documentary, which has been really important for a lot of members of our church, and I would encourage people to watch it if they haven't already.
And it's fascinating to learn this stuff. And there's another brilliant woman named Kathy Baldock. And as I read that book, I realized, wow, like there is so much that we don't realize about the Bible. There's so much that we don't realize about our own political system, our own social system, our own medical system, our own psychiatric system, of things that have changed. And I think I'm learning to question more. I'm learning to doubt more, but that's not pushing me away. It's pulling me in. And it's helping me to grow deeper. And I remember a conversation that I had with my mom. Another great book that I read this year was Untamed by Glennon Doyle. And she wrote about this crazy story about the religious right and how it came to be. And she mentioned something wacko in there about like life for fundamentalist Christians used to begin at first breath. I was like, no, it didn't. Like, it's always been at conception. There's no way. And as I dug into it, and my mom dug into it, we were both like, oh my gosh, she's right. Like, what do you mean? Like, these things can't change. These things were always. And as I started to look back and started to see, like, our church positions that we've held on to, that we've been taught to believe, we haven't believed those things forever. And those have been things that have been adopted. Those have been things that have been translated. Those things have been changed and brought into the conversation. They're not biblical. They're not of God. They're not from Jesus. They're man-made interpretations that have been voted in, that have been pushed in, that have been warred in, that have been killed in. And I think as Christians, and I'll speak personally, I believed everything was for right now for me, and had a very naive view of what the Bible was. And I can now see that I allowed something to condemn me that I knew nothing about. And because I was so terrified and was so frightened by this weapon, I never took the time to understand there is no boogeyman there.
And yeah, the sadness of that, right, as you say, because it's so weaponized, you don't want to draw closer to it. And I feel I should point out that there's a danger, and people might say, well, that means you're not taking the Bible seriously. And my response is that, no, this is taking the Bible really seriously. This is seeing how the Bible was translated 5,000 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 1,500 years ago, 2,000 years ago, 2,500 years ago, if we want to just speak explicitly about the Old Testament. And what are the issues that are going on at the time? What do we think that the scriptures are speaking to those people in those moments? How do we apply those now? And for me, that's taking scripture really seriously, actually.
Right. And it was interesting. My dad and I are reading this book called Irresistible. And again, I don't know the author. What I learned just this week is the Old Testament, actually, when translated properly, is the obsolete covenant. And I always looked at the Bible again as one piece. I never really looked at it that clearly. It's like Jesus came to fulfill the law. So like that covenant, the old covenant, is done. And yet, part of our evangelical upbringing has been mixing parts of the old with parts of the new. And when you start to look at, well, what was Paul doing? He was saying, don't mix those things. And yet, so much of what I've allowed to condemn me has been that mixing, has been that, well, no, you have to be here and you have to be here and you have to pull all of these things together. And again, I find myself embarrassed that I never even knew that. I never questioned that. I always thought, well, the guy up front went to Bible college and he knows all the answers. Of course, he's going to tell us if that's the case. And so much of my upbringing has been, how do I abdicate my own thinking? How do I abdicate my own thoughts, my own feelings? Because, of course, those are evil if they're coming from me. But they are holy and just and right and loving if they're coming from usually the white man standing a few levels up at the front. And I'm now seeing that's not how any of us were designed.
That's really helpful. And Well, for those of you that go to Wellspring, you know I'm very quick to say that I don't know anything. So that's one step we're trying to make. That's really helpful. We've got a couple of questions that have come in, and I'm going to lean into those now because we've been talking for. This is so much fun. I knew this was going to happen. I'm just going to move forward. A couple of good questions have come in. Thank you. Yeah. So one of the things that you said in your video that Wellspring saw last Sunday is you say that you consider your sexuality a gift from God. Mm-hmm. Would you be willing to explain that a little bit more? Because again, so much of our history has been about this is something we try to pray away, and but instead you see it as a gift. And I'd really be interested by what you have to say there.
And so I'll be a little bit combative with my answer. Or I'll ask a question. Do you see your sexuality as a gift?
I mean, I'm a bit weird, but probably not. I don't know. I don't think my sexuality is anything, really. I guess that's, I suppose I haven't really been forced to.
Do you see your nose as a gift from God?
I'm not a big fan of my nose.
No?
Is that, are you trying to...
Your hands,
trying to put my
your feet.
Hands are a bit smaller than I'd like. I'm good with my hands.
Your personhood.
Yes, there we go. Yeah, sure.
And I look at it at the same way. Now I've learned to look at it the same way. And I think so much of who we are as Christians and as evangelical Christians, we condemn homosexuality. Really what we're saying is we're condemning the act of sexual intercourse between men. And when we look at somebody, we can't let them in. It's like, well, why? Why not? And that's where I am very conscious of putting that out there. Like, my sexuality is a gift. Just like my speech is a gift, just like my brain is a gift. Like, we are all, and all that we are created are gifts from God. And I think sexuality, especially homosexuality, has been so poisoned by man and the interpretation around that I want to just be very conscious of, well, it's no more right or wrong than a hand or a nose or a head or a person, and yet we've turned it into something being very unnatural, to use biblical words. And I like to push people now too and say, well, biblically, what did they mean by unnatural? I think one of the other words that has been weaponized is sodomy. And what I was really interested to discover over the last year is that the biblical definition of sodomy is any form of non-procreative sex by anyone. And so if we were here in person in a congregation, I would look around and say, so all of y'all...
We don't straight up know, but let's
But I would
assume.
make the assumption, and I had the very awkward conversation with my parents of if you are still having sex, and I don't want the answer, but biblically, that's sodomy, because I don't know.
Also making an assumption.
Also making an assumption. I would hope that my parents aren't trying to have children still. But so much of that has been mistranslated, and not only by church, by society, and the words have taken on different meanings. And so I want to push those definitions. I want to get those things out there so that people really understand where this stuff is coming from.
Yeah, as you say, it's interesting the way as words evolve. As I've shared here that the Bible very clearly says in Ezekiel 16:49 what the sin of Sodom was. It says the sin of Sodom is that you didn't look after the poor and the widow. It's really clear. And so it's so interesting to me that we can completely ignore the Bible where it says, by the way, this was the sin of Sodom, and yet we can kind of create what the sin of Sodom is, and how really how selective people have been with Scripture to create the narrative that has got us here, I suppose.
And I think we don't want to admit the fallibility of man. I don't think we want to admit that some of our leaders are great marketers, great fundraisers, great at building. We use the words building a kingdom. I wouldn't use those words. I would say building a bank account. And when you look back at history and when you look at what's happening right now, of course they're going to use that. It's very lucrative to use those words. It pulls people in. And I think right now, one of the challenges we see in our world all around us is it's an amazing strategy for building a church. It's an amazing strategy for getting funds in the door. Double down on hate, double down on fear. People will open their wallets instantly because they want that to go away. Because there is a belief and a human belief that like, ooh, get that away. And if I pay money, that uncomfortable thought or feeling goes away, at least temporarily. And the great part for so many leaders is that fear comes back. So you need to keep pushing it away. So you need to keep giving. But we don't want to talk about that because that's gross, and we don't really talk about those things because that's a worldly thing. We're in a church, and I've always believed, and I see how this has harmed me in the corporate world. I see how this has harmed me in the political world, where I believed that all the people up at the front, all the people that have the power are good, and that they're perfect, and that you don't question them. And that's not true. They're no better, no worse than you or me or anyone else. And for so many years of my life, I gaslit myself. I thought anything coming from within me, well, it must be sarcastic, it must be sinful, it must be wrong. You can't question those things. Who are you? And what I'm realizing is that was me denying God. That was me taking, in church terms, what we call spiritual gifts, which I just think are strengths, are values. But we like to put kind of our own spin on things.
Well, we can say that God was involved in
And it's convenient when pastors hand out spiritual gifts to people. I think it's a very, I would love that in the corporate world.
Very condemned here. This is we're supposed to condemn other people, James, not me.
It's great with volunteers.
You have the gift of doing the job I need you to do right now. Isn't that good?
You have the gift of hospitality, and I need some water.
Laura got us the water before this.
And I think it's natural human tendency, and I think my eyes are starting to open in a very neat way. And I'm starting to find my voice. And also one of the other interesting things that I found over the last year is that it ain't just me. This is not a gay thing. It's not a queer thing. It's not an LGBTQ2S+ thing. It's a human thing. And the more women that I speak to, the more people with disabilities or different abilities, the more racialized people that I speak to, everyone's saying me too. Everyone's saying, I feel the exact same way. And the details of my story are way different. But yeah, me too. And I think that's one of the challenges and one of the most amazing parts about where we find ourselves in society today is everyone now has the ability to say me too. Everybody has the access to a microphone, a cell phone, a podcast. You don't need anything really to start telling their story. And I am a firm believer that's what we were created to do. We were put on this earth to have a human experience and to use our voice, to use our talents, to use our strengths, no matter who we are. And that probably the first verse that all of us learned from going to church, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him shall not perish but have everlasting life. The world, that's all of us. That's not like, for God so loved the white man.
He got all the gifts.
He gets all the gifts and all the glory. And those white men that believe in him shall take over all. That's not it at all. And that's where it's shocking to see what we believe. And leaving the church and now kind of coming back, I'm reminded at how challenged some of our beliefs are. And I guess I just forgot about this. I was having a conversation with my mom, and I said, Mom, so at your church, can women be on the board? And my mom answered in a very my mom kind of way. And she's like, well, I don't want to be on them. I'm like, fair enough.
That's not the question. Also, hi to both of our mums. Who
yes,
have
if my mom's watching.
Excellent choice in naming their children, if nothing else.
And I forgot that, oh yeah, that's right. Like, we seem to have forgotten that part about, like, it sounds so weird for me to even say that, like, gender is a social justice issue with the church. And I don't understand how anyone with a daughter involved in the church can say, honey, you can be whoever you are. Like, we've just celebrated International Women's Day, but you can't be daddy, and you can't be daddy's job because you're a woman. And we still believe that. And I don't understand how that happens. And I know that we've evolved, and the last time I went to church with my dad, I kind of elbowed him. And I'm like, oh, it says pastor female name here. What's going on? And he looks and he's like, well, it's not a real pastor. It's like a family ministries. And like, they're allowed certain roles, but it can't be lead pastor. And I think we found wiggle room to make people happy. And that's not right. Not right at all. And so what we're talking about here, and what I'm loving about the journey that you're doing on with Wellspring, is that it's talking about inclusion. It's talking about everyone, the world. And it's not a gay issue. It's a human issue.
That's excellent. I'm going to find another question, because that is a great line to end on. Actually, there was one. So this is maybe, speaking from where a few people at the congregation are at. This line say, name top three things. Three things you'd like to see in a community that welcomes everyone. Like, what are the kind of things that you're looking out for? That's not quite as deep as entrenched as some of them. It's real practical, and all of a sudden I freeze up around those things. I'm like, oh, I can get into the historiography of the Bible and why it doesn't say what you think it is. But when the rubber hits the road, you suddenly go, oh.
So top three things.
It can also be four. Like,
four, okay.
We're not that legalistic here.
I don't know. That's a great question. I would say it's be who you say you are. Walk the talk. Don't hide your hate. Put it out in front if there is any. I remember having a conversation. My brother is a pastor, and lucky him and lucky me. I remember he was starting at a church, a Baptist church, and it had these disclaimers about this issue or topic that I find myself being as a human. And it's always fun kind of coming back into church environments and realizing that you're referred to as a topic that's hard for people. And I remember my brother saying, I've talked with the church, and we got to take that down off the homepage, because that's not really nice to like greet people that way. And I was like, oh my gosh, no. Keep it up on the homepage, because I would rather know if I'm being excluded off the bat. And like, to me, like,
like, let's think about cigarette packages here. Like, put the bleeding gums and the warnings, like, right up front of the church so I know not to enter because this will kill me. And I think one of the most damaging things I've found, I lived in Australia and went to Hillsong, and from a evangelical perspective, like, whoa, like that's the pinnacle. Like being at Hillsong and going to their Hills campus was like, whoa,
the Mecca.
The Mecca of everything amazing. And I went with my boyfriend, and it was an amazing, amazing experience. We were welcomed. We were in Australia. Everyone looked gay. And everything was amazing until you get to home church. And been going for a few months and kind of starting to get to know people, getting into home church. And then I was just talking normally, and my boyfriend, and it's like the record just scratched. It's like, excuse me? Excuse me? And the hurt of feeling like you might be included, the excitement of being welcomed or thinking that you're being welcomed, and then to be hit with that 3 or 4 months in, it's like you've had a wound that is healing and is scabbed over, and then I'm a picker, and then you finally pick that off, and you're like, oh gosh, now we have to go way back to square one. And so I don't know if there's 3 things, but I'm just like, be who you say you are, put it out front. And I guess the question that I would ask back is, what are you afraid of? To say that you are welcoming without an asterisk, what's the fear? Like, I know that there is a tendency, a growing tendency in evangelical circles to have leaders or have members start to sign whatever the proper name that is created, kind of statements of belief or leadership whatevers, where it's like, you need to sign that you believe exactly all of these same things that we have created.
You'll be unsurprised to know that I didn't sign that, and we got into a lot of trouble for it.
And I like why? And when other people come through the door, do you make them sign things like, I have never looked and lusted at another human. I have never been divorced. I have never whatever, the long list. And it's like, no, that's not on there. And the number of stories and the number of people that have reached out to me with devastating stories of children, queer children, growing up in the church and going to Christian camps and becoming counselors, and then having those camps send out those statements, and the kids being truthful, saying, I can't sign this, and not being able to go back to the one place where they actually felt accepted because the child was willing to be honest. And I think what we are teaching our congregations, our members, our participants, whatever you want to call them, is, yeah, you're welcome here, but you need to lie to us. And I applaud you for standing up and for not signing things. But I would say that you're a weirdo. Like, most people are just
like... A lot of people have told me that too.
Most people would just say, like, honestly, just sign it. Why are you just causing yourself more grief? Just sign it. Nobody's actually going to hold you to it. We just need you to sign it. Stop being a pain in the ass. And really what we're teaching people is don't be honest. Don't be truthful.
There's a consistency of a desire for authenticity that we hope you, as a member of the queer community, just don't be like too queer around us. Mm-hmm. Just hide it, and then we can be okay. And even though I deep down might actually be okay with it, I'm still going to sign something saying I'm not. And so there's this, and I think one of the things that the church is forever criticized for, and quite rightly so a lot of the time, is, I'm exhausted in my week, and then at the end of it, I'm expected to go somewhere where I have to be somehow more perfect. And I don't know how that came to be. I don't think that was the desire. I certainly don't think it's the church that Jesus shows us. I think being on our authentic selves is the best thing that we can do and the best thing that we can offer as a church. And so hearing the manifold ways that the church has failed to do that it's hard to hear.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think that's another thing. What is the church that Jesus showed us? And I think that's another thing that we have mistranslated and misunderstood. And what we forget, there was a temple that was being dismantled. There was no Bible. There was a Jewish covenant. But the things that we hold as dogma for being a Christian didn't exist. And we look back and we have this magical thinking that is all divine, but it's not. And we don't question that. And I think we need to do a lot more questioning and a lot more doubting. And that's okay. And it's interesting because I went to weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks of Bible study, but I never studied the Bible. And I think and I don't want to be very accusatory here, but there's systems of control. Like we give people enough to feel like, oh, I'm studying the Bible because I've read. And I'm like, but you're not. You're studying what's being put in front of you. You're studying things that people are asking you to look at from a perspective that is of someone's agenda. But you're not really studying the Bible. And I think that's where church leaders, I think there's an opportunity to push congregations, to push people back to a more personal challenge of do your own homework, do your own investigation. And it's not easy. It's not comfortable. It's not bite-sized. It's not going to be something that you can kind of sum up in a three-week sermon series kind of thing. And it is a journey, and it's a painful one. And what I love about learning about the Jewish tradition is that the Bible or the scriptures are a jumping off point for a debate, for a conversation. And I wish that we had more of that, where I think in my tradition and in my view of the church historically is that the Bible has been the period at the end of the sentence, the ruling, the black and white. It hasn't been an open up for a debate. It's the like, boom, done. And I don't know that that's the intention either. And I think for so many of us, thank you for opening this the way that you did on, I haven't done it right. None of us have. And I think, not that I can speak on behalf of the queer community, nobody does it right from any side. And I think for so long, I've literally given my finger back to the church and said, you know what? You've been a place of damage. You've been a place of pain. Screw you. Throw it all away. And that's not the answer either. And where I think I need to come from a better place, where marginalized, I would hope people can find the strength and the vulnerability to come from a more open place as well, is to give people the grace and the forgiveness to mess things up. And I think in society right now, we are so terrified of screwing up. We're so terrified of the queer community that like, oh my gosh, what is it like? Does it start with an L or a G? And there's like, what's the 2 and the S and the plus? Like, I'm just not going to say anything because I'm going to sound like an idiot. And I hope that we can all find grace, that we can all screw things up, that we can all feel uncomfortable. Because when we're screwing things up and when we're feeling uncomfortable, when we're in pain, that means that we're growing. And I think as humans, we've taken such a different view of that, and we've told ourselves, or we've been lied to, that when we're uncomfortable, it means we're failing. And that's not the case. Uncomfortable means that we're growing. And we should search that out, not run from that.
I think that's a really important point for me, and I'm sure for lots of the people watching. As you say, I say this all the time. So one of the reasons I hate camping is why wouldn't I hate camping? I don't know. I like my bed, I like my shower, I like the internet, and camping has none of those things. Like, I'm a creature of comfort. I actively seek out comfort, and I do all I can to run from discomfort. But in this instance, ultimately, running from discomfort is more damaging than we realize. And I think even what you said there, that I'm so scared of saying the wrong thing. And I'm sure there are members of the community who have been so hurt by the church that actually anything we say will be hurtful for them. And we get to pray that healing happens, and we get to accept that maybe we are not the ones that can heal them. We also recognize there are members of the community who will be really graceful, and recognize probably they have been really graceful with you a lot of the time. Mm-hmm. But I do remember when my grandmother passed away, and my grandfather remembered the silence, and one of his friends who was walking down the street and crossed the road before he thought he'd seen him. And he said, I don't think he was being malicious. I don't think he was being cruel. I just think he didn't know what to say. But actually, anything would have been better than nothing. Mm-hmm. And I think we're at this point now where realistically, the LGBTQ2+ community, if the church doesn't say anything, they assume they're not wanted. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely. And I have this conversation with my parents all the time. I think we have to remember the 8-year-old or the 10-year-old kid. And as churches, we like to go back and say, well, yeah, we've got that policy, and yeah, it's a denominational thing, but our church, we don't really believe that. So whatever, nobody looks at that. The 10-year-old kid does look at that. The 10-year-old kid, when he Googles, what does this denomination believe about? Those are the first things that come up. And so the things as adults we understand don't really mean what they say that they mean. And as adults, we can have these nuanced conversations. We've learned to live in the gray, I hope, as we go on. But kids don't have that privilege. And as a child, I believed that everyone in the congregation believed exactly what the man at the front said. And I can remember, this is the other crazy thing about thinking back. We would have people from Exodus International come into our church back then.
Could you fill people in on who that is?
So Exodus International, they were the biggest conversion therapy. And so conversion therapy was the belief, the fake pseudoscience that has been disproven over and over and over with a success rate of 0.
It's fairly damning percentages, I'd say.
Fairly damning percentages. But back when I was young, they would come into our church and they were missionaries. They would tell their story about how their sexual orientation has changed and Jesus saved them and the whole 9 yards. And we would pray over them. We would do a special offering and give money to them. And I remember as a child, literally was thinking, everyone putting money into that offering plate is voting against me. Everyone. And like you said with your grandpa, that probably wasn't their intention. They're just doing what you're supposed to do and guilted into giving. And if I don't give, people are going to think I'm whatever. But as a child, I was like, oh my God, everyone believes this. And I think we always have to remind ourselves, how would those children know that you don't hate them? how do those children know that your view is different? And I'm like, do we need to put like a coded, like the people with the purple Bible really love you. They don't believe what, and we need to find ways to say we don't all believe the same thing. And we probably don't need to. And I think that's the great thing about being human, about being unique, being about like designed that way by God, is that we don't all need to believe the same thing. We don't all need, but where I do draw the line is we don't all need to believe the same thing, but your beliefs can't hate someone else for who they are. They can do things that you might not agree with, and that's fine. But to exclude an entire group of people because of who they are, and it hit me this year that famous statement, love the sinner, hate the sin. For me and for so many queer people in history, for so many women, for so many people of color, sin to us was both a noun and a verb. And for people with privilege, sin is only a verb. And you can stop the things that you're doing. You can stop going to a prostitute. You can stop stealing. You can stop. I can't stop being gay. And finally, the church has kind of come around to, well, yeah, you can't. When I was growing up, I could, apparently. But you can't stop being black. You can't stop being a woman. And I think that's where the real damage comes in. And so sin can't be a noun. And when you exclude people and when you call their nounness a sin, that's where I have a problem. And I think a lot of the conversation right now is, well, the Christians are being persecuted. We can't say anything about LGBT people without being attacked. And oh my gosh.
You can say nice things.
Yeah, you can say
you can say stuff.
You can say nice things, but this is where I do have a challenge, and it's like, well, because what you're saying is hate. What you're saying is homophobia. What you're saying is misogynistic. What you're saying is racist. What you're not doing, you're not sharing God's love. And I think as Christians and as churchgoers, we hide behind that. And fear, again, is a great motivator. It's great to be on TV and to say we are being persecuted. And I think in the news right now in Canada, we were talking about it earlier, where the Christian church is under attack. The government won't allow us to open. And, well, yeah, if the Christians are being persecuted, so are the barbers. It's like, so is everyone right now.
So are the barbers, so are the Muslims, so, yeah.
Like, it's, you don't get to say, well, I guess anybody can get to say that, but it's a marketing tactic. It's a way to show persecution to help people feel sorry for you, but that's not actually what's happening. And I think that's where, back to that earlier question, what can the church do? Be real. Let's talk about these things. Let's bring these things out into the light. And I think that's what everyone's looking for. Let's just get real. Let's have a human experience with everyone. Let's bring some of those things that we've all been wondering. Why not? And I remember as a kid always getting in trouble because I was that annoying kid that was like, well, why? Like, give me a reason, not just like, because we said so, because we're your parents, because the flannel graph in Sunday school said that's the way it happened. Why?
Flannel graph is also another thing that when you're not raised in a super Christian world, there's like a whole thing.
It's a whole, like, the things that can happen on a flannel graph board. Like, but that doesn't make it true. And we are allowed to ask those questions. Like, we are allowed to not believe the same things. And it doesn't mean that we are any less Christian than the other. It doesn't mean, like, what did Jesus ask us to believe? Like that, John 3:16 tells us it all. Like, there's not a super long list of like, you need to sign off on all of these things and believe all of these same, like that was created by us. And again, realizing how much of this stuff has been man-made, how much of this stuff has been created over time. And like, even like when we think back at how mind-blowing we got around gay marriage, and like, oh my, this is not God's definition. Like, what is God's definition of marriage? Like, and I won't let you
stand away from it.
Yeah, I won't get into that. But like, people don't understand that like God and marriage didn't come about until the 1100s. Like, before that, it was totally civil. And yet it was the Catholic Church that brought that in. It became dogmatic. It became part of what we believed. And yet we go off the deep end about these things. And we go off the deep end like, God made Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. It can't happen this way. It's like, okay, well then let's go biblical marriage. Like, talk to me about King Solomon. Talk to me about the different forms of marriage. And once you start practicing that, let's giddy up.
Just in case we're clear, I do not advocate you marrying the widow of the person that you killed in combat. That's one form of biblical marriage, which I actually stand against. Against killing altogether, actually.
And that's where, like, I felt so dumb not knowing this. And as a little kid, my juvenile belief of like David and Goliath, like this helpless little boy, and he is a Bible hero, and King David, and my middle name is David, and like thinking all of these things. And then the more that I read, I'm like, David was a dick. Wow.
That's the Instagram quote from this session.
He slaughtered people.
Yeah, David has his complexities.
He has his challenges. And then you start, like, but King Solomon was David's son. I didn't really know. That wasn't, okay. And he had 700 wives?
699 complexities, I think that's it.
And they all had different gods, and then he had to build temple because they were like, and you're like, oh. And like all of these things you start to unpack, but again, back to the magical thinking and the magical belief is that like, well, we'll put that over there. Everything is good. And again, I think we are all human. We are all unique. We all need different forms of certainty, uncertainty, and if you choose to believe in the creation story, if you choose to say it's an allegory and it's not, who cares? It doesn't make me or you, and you not knowing what I believe doesn't make, like, is that a reason to stop someone at the door? Do we stop people at the door and kind of ask? We don't. But we do for somebody's sexual act. And that's where I think we need to be a little bit more open and encouraging and inclusive and treat people like humans. Treat people like you would want to be treated.
I'm looking at the time, and I know we could carry on talking for a long time about this, but I want to be conscious of your time, and I think that's a really superb way to end. Yeah, we treat people as humans. We love our neighbor. Jesus makes it really quite simple, and yet we've worked very hard to make it more complicated. I feel bad because just so people that know me, I'm like, we should talk for another 8 hours, but I want to be protective of your time, and I want to be conscious of the people watching at home. It's not as fun watching a screen as it is being here in person. I do really want to thank you for this, and this has been really helpful for me. I hope it's been helpful for us. It's been wonderful to hear you share, and I think I truly think there's a real anointing on the work that you're doing. I think it's one of the most important things, especially in a city in Toronto right now in 2021. You have a message that both the queer and straight community need to hear. I think that's crucially important. And any to sign off with, James has asked us to play a video, which he's found. I also realized there's a bunch of questions we didn't get to. I guess that's a good problem to have, but can people contact you after that? I should have asked you this beforehand. Is that okay?
Yeah, no, definitely.
Are you contactable? Maybe not.
Yeah, and so if you want to, you can take a look. My website is thislittlelightofmine.ca. And so all my episodes are there. I can be contacted through there and would love to chat with anyone on this. I would just remind people the journey that you're on is an amazing one, and it should be messy. It should be uncomfortable. And that's one of the things that I'm learning. It was interesting talking to my mom. She's learning that too. Like, it's not supposed to fit into this nice tidy box with the ribbon on it that looks perfect. And so much of what we've been taught in our church experience is that is what we are supposed to aim for. It's not. This is messy. It is uncomfortable. It is going to be up and down and all over the place. And it's not this kind of straight, kind of upward facing trend. There's going to be good days. There's going to be bad days because it's a human experience. And go with it.
Thank you. Do you want to introduce the video that you've left us with? I'm guessing there's a reason you've chosen it, and you can probably say it better than I can.
Yeah, so it's interesting. Somebody sent me this video just yesterday. And so I don't really have much of a background to that. It's called Hey Jesus. And it's a music video. I'll let you guys watch it, but as I watched it and listened to it for the first time, it really encapsulated what you're going through on kind of questions about being inclusive. And it just reminds people that it's people on the other side. This isn't a topic. This isn't a challenging conversation. It's people. It's people that are hurting. And it's your own nephew. It's your own grandchild. It's your own daughter. It's your own wife that's going through this. And even though you might not see that people are hurting, there's a lot of people that are, and we have to remember that.